I'd like to briefly reflect with you for a few moments on contemplative Christianity and classical Athenian spirituality. There's been a tendency within Christianity to perhaps overemphasize orthodoxy and getting ideas and theology right. The nature of Father, Son, and Spirit, the two natures of Christ, the nature of the incarnation, soteriology, the notion of redemption, but significant elements of Christian theology have focused on grappling with making sense in a doctrinal, dogmatic way, the nature of Christianity. The response to orthodoxy has often been, well, the faith has to be lived, so orthopraxis. So what's this look like when lived? And there's been great discussions within Christianity in terms of what trumps what, in terms of the faithful living out of the Christian tradition. Does the Sermon on the Mount trump a magisterial tradition at certain points when Christ calls us to love an enemy? On the other hand, the state feels they have to kill the enemy. What's the relationship of one's personal faith journey, relationship of that to community, relationship of that to friendship, relationship of that to the church, the relationship of that to public life itself? And so that's orthopraxis. So these two have tended to interact with one another, orthodoxy and orthopraxis, throughout the history of the Christian tradition. Some have tried to synthesize them, and they've done them well. Others have pitted one against the other, arguing one trumps the other. Thinking is more important than action. Others would argue that action trumps thinking. What's often gets lost in this whole discussion, and why I think in many ways there's a renaissance of it today, is the importance of the contemplative tradition, or the vita contemplativa. And we're seeing a great, one sense, resurrection of the contemplative way that doesn't fit neatly into a certain way of doing orthodoxy, and doesn't fit easily into just orthopraxis. It comes both as a critique of them, a deepening of them, and a transformation probably of both. And then, since that's the third leg on the stool, so orthodoxy, orthopraxis, and contemplative theology itself, which is a way of synthesizing theology and practice at a much deeper level, going to the roots of it, and then the outworking of that in a very different way. This is why, for example, I think, say, within the Catholic tradition, people are very drawn to Thomas Merton, Bede Griffiths, Richard Rohr, Thomas Keating, because they're articulating and they're living forth the contemplative tradition. Within elements of the Protestant tradition, we see the interests, for example, in Taizé, the Renovar movement initiated by Foster and Dallas Willard and people like that. The turn to orthodoxy, the intrigue with the Philokalia, the monastic tradition, Mount Athos, and things like this. And so it's coming from a variety of directions. The Roman Catholic, the Orthodox, within the Protestant ressourcement tradition, as well as the Catholic element of that. There is this emergence as a hunger, a longing for something deeper in terms of an existential experience of the dogmas of faith, but also questioning just a form of activism or sort of orthopraxis that lacks a contemplative depth. So then, sociologically, we're very much experiencing this interest in contemplative Christianity. Now, in saying that, one of the dilemmas is, for many people who are at the forefront of this resurgence, this renaissance of contemplative Christianity, often pit the contemplative tradition against Greek thought, and they tend to demean Greek thought and see it as the problem, and it's something to be avoided in terms of an authentic contemplative journey. Some in this, in terms of pitting Greek against contemplative, they'll turn to, say, the Orient, for example, or they'll look at various forms of New Age spirituality. But one of the great sources, obviously, of contemplative Christianity is the classical Athenian tradition. What might be some of the reasons that that the leadership of significant elements of, say, Renoir or Ressourcement, or elements of that, um, Richard Rohr, for example, and there's many others, tend to demean the classical Athenian tradition. One way, and this is much more indebted to, say, Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. Nietzsche and Heidegger argued that with the coming of Socrates and Plato, um, reason or rationalism came to trump the deep experience of beingness, or the pre-Socratic way of knowing. And so what you get is reason and logical thinking, induction and deduction, and almost logical chess games take over in the bigger metaphysical way of knowing. And the contemplative way is about experience at an ever deeper level, not a devotional understanding of experience, but a deeply transformative understanding of experience. So if reason gets in the way of a deeper contemplative existentialism, and the Greeks embody that, why would we turn to the Greeks? Because they're the ones that prevent us from knowing that. Now, people like Nietzsche and Heidegger, Nietzsche turned to the Greek tragedians, and Heidegger turned to the pre-Socratics in terms of seeing this was the essence of the real contemplative traditions, or openness to being. But they both concurred with the fact that classical Greek thought, Socrates, Plato, it became excessively rational, and the Western tradition really is indebted to that, which undermines or demotes the deeper contemplative tradition. And a lot of people then who turn against Greek or classical Athenian spirituality argue that this is the birth of rationalism. Rationalism is at odds with the contemplative. Therefore, we have to demote reason from the throne. Now, this, of course, totally distorts the Greek understanding of reason in terms of nous, or noetic faculty, a meditative faculty. So you find in Aristotle, contemplation is the very highest in Plato's Symposium. In Phaedrus, contemplation is really, and Socrates, of course, when he reaches the end of a certain understanding of reason, Delphic oracle, diatema. So there's this one way of seeing the Greeks, which caricatures the Greeks. I might also add that when most people dismiss the Greeks, one of the first questions you have to ask is, what do you know about the Greeks? So there's this, and I would say the second one is they're equated with Gnosticism, separating a dualism, a separation from spirit from matter, a demeaning of matter, and to some degree those were the cruder Gnostics did that, but certainly not the classical Greeks. They had a very highly integrative, thoughtful, and I might add, classical Greek spirituality was far more integrated than, say, biblical. Even biblical propheticism, the level of philosophical reflection by Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in terms of public life, Aristotle's politics, and Plato on the Republic and the laws and the statesman and the Gorgias, and Socrates grappling with these issues. The level of in-depth reflection in terms of spirituality and politics that goes on in classical Greek spirituality, you find nothing like that in the biblical tradition, which is more what we call a revelatory, thus saith the Lord, and you'll have prophets speaking about justice and peace, but it's not sort of developed philosophical reflections, it's more emotive conclusions. So in classical Greek spirituality, it's deeply prophetic, it's deeply contemplative, and it's certainly not dualistic that separates spirit from matter. A third area, which often in terms of classical Athenian spirituality, it's dismissed as well, Greek reasoning undermines theology, and thereby extension religion. And so underneath this is the notion that philosophy undermines theology, so why would you study philosophy? And the fountainhead of all philosophy in the West anyway is the Greeks. Their way of thinking clashes with theology or revelatory truth, and so why go down that pathway? Well, again, that's in Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, their understanding of the contemplative life in that sense is an interior openness to the overtures of the divine. And they recognize very clearly that there's a lower level of way of thinking, logic, induction, deduction, empirical, but at the higher levels, the mind and soul is open to the insights of divine love in that sense. And so these three often objections to Greek thought, I might add the other one often is those who argue that if you're going to be authentically Christian, you have to stay within the Jewish roots of it. And this is also connects with the more you get away from the Jewish tradition, you get into those meddling Greeks, and Christianity lost its way in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century as it engaged classical thought, classical Greek. It was more Middle Platonism at that time, and this capitulation to Greek thought undermined, it thinned out, it distorted Christianity. And so there's this whole other form also of Christian thought in which the more Christianity emerged out of the cocoon of the Jewish world into the classic world, it began to lose its depth, its insight, when in fact the reality is, historically, to the degree that the early Christian thinkers engaged classical thought, that's what created the whole Western civilization. If they had restricted themselves purely to the Hebrew tradition, they would have remained an isolated little ghetto. But to the degree they took the best of the Jewish tradition, the Roman, and the richness of classical Greek thought, synthesized them, this is essentially what created Western civilization and large elements of the East, particularly orthodoxy as well. And so this notion that somehow the Greek tradition undermines theology, it's anti-material, it's rationalistic. These are all distortions usually articulated by people really who have probably read none of the, or very little of the Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, probably haven't read Homer that much, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the historians Thucydides, or Herodotus, or they'll quote little lines out of Plato or Aristotle and say, well, this is what Plato thought. It'd be like taking a few little sentences out of the Bible and say, this is what the Bible means. So you get this highly superficial read of people who dismiss classical Athenian spirituality and then use that as the negative by which they put forward the positive of Jewish Christian thought in all of its best. So when we see people who want to turn their backs on classical Greek thought, first thing one always has to ask is, which Greek are you talking about? What text are you using? And if we're going to be honest about talking about a whole civilization, it's not homogeneous to begin with. Plato and Aristotle had their differences. Both were engaging Greek tragic tragedians, and you had Aristophanes. And so the danger is to say the Greeks think that. It's a bit like saying Western civilization thinks this, or biblical thought is that. All of these traditions are layered, they're nuanced, and to understand them is to then enter into the richness. And also early Christianity always took the notion of what's called the logos spermaticos. There was the seed of the word, or the logos was in the soil of all great civilizations. So just as the Jewish tradition was a preparation for the coming of Christ, so was the classical Greek civilization, and so was the greatness of the Roman tradition, as was the Celtic tradition. When the early missionaries went to India, they saw in the great thinking of the spiritual theological classics of Indian thought, the seed of the word. And so when we think of Christianity, and particularly contemplative Christianity, and certain forms of it that are very dismissive of the Greeks, the first question that has to be asked, well, whose version of the Greeks are you talking about? Okay, whose version, both at a theological level, at a contemplative level, at a transformative level. And often people who make these dismissive statements, they know very little about the Greeks. So you get this fascinating balance of ignorance and arrogance. And this combination of ignorance and arrogance that in a sweeping of the hands, this is what the Greeks think. You want to say, well, there's far more to any civilization than a few little lines that we can draw from a text. If we're going to enter in a substantive way into classical Athenian spirituality, there is a mother lode in this tradition. And this is why the early Christians from the second, I mean, even the book of John begins with, in the beginning was the Word. He's using the notion of the Logos that the pre-Socratic thinkers used, that obviously is central to classical Athenian spirituality. So even you're dealing with in the early Gospels, when Paul goes to Athens, he draws from the great literary tradition of the Greeks as well. And so if we put a sign, sort of no entrance, in terms of the trailhead to the Greeks, and see this is a problem in terms of understanding Christian theology, contemplative Christianity, then in fact we're shutting ourselves off from a great bounty and a feast that the early church never did. Now, there was, of course, a tradition in Christianity of Tertullian. What has the Athens to do with Jerusalem, the church to do with the academy? And the church, to some degree, has tried to make sense of the relationship of church and academy, seminaries, and many of them churches have started universities. But sometimes there persists that Tertullian mindset that the revelatory tradition of Christianity, or the Jews, has really has little in common with Athens, because Athens undermines theology, it undermines philosophy, undermines theology, form of Greek reason undermines the contemplative. And these are all very shallow understandings, and in being so, they actually shut people off who are interested in the contemplative journey from going to the bountiful table from which the best of that contemplative way of knowing and being has been thought through in a very sophisticated and meaningful manner. And so when we think then of the emergence of contemplative Christianity, we must be very wary of those who, particularly the gurus in contemplative Christianity, who are being heeded and heard, particularly those who see the Greeks as the problem, okay, in terms of the contemplative journey. In fact, I would argue the Greeks are the remedy, and they are the great healing balm, and that's the way the early church understood it. That's the way significant elements of Christianity historically have thought. And this Jerusalem-Athens dualism is a very unhealthy dualism, and to truly an integrative vision, that's where, if contemplative Christianity in the present sense is going to be integrative rather than reactionary, we're going to have women and men who really enter into the depth of classical Athenian spirituality, because it's from that gold mine and mother lode that in fact the riches of the past can be brought forward in the present, and a deeper cultural, personal, and ecclesial transformation takes place.